Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Learn Everyday English, your roadway to English proficiency. I'm in my new location in the house where I may be recording more videos like this in front of the fireplace. I think it makes for a good backdrop. I got the lighting seems to be okay. I don't have a lot of distractions in the background. So it looks like it may work out okay or okie dokie for me. And I'm going to be talking about a topic or subject that some people find uncomfortable about, but to me it's reality. It's reality. It's something that you can't ignore because we all have to face it or deal with it sometimes in our life when other people say pass away or die, or something that eventually is going to happen to us, because there's an expression we have in English. There's two things that are certain in life: death and taxes. Death and taxes. And I'm just trying to be realistic about it. So we're going to talk about death here in the United States. But before I get into that, there's 3 things that you can do for me. Hey, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and 3, tell your friends about it so that they can benefit from these videos too, just like you. All right, I thought of doing this video because recently we had a death in the family. My wife's mother, or my mother-in-law, recently passed away. We say passed away or died in El Paso, Texas, and I had to go there to meet my wife, and we went through the wake and funeral and the whole process that's customary here in the United States. And I know maybe these types of things, what people do when somebody dies kind of changes or varies or is different depending on what part of the world you're in, what is your culture, and what are your customs. So I thought it would be interesting to tell you kind of what is pretty common here in the United States that people do when they have a loved one or somebody that dies. And this is coming from more of a Christian tradition, if you're a Catholic or you're Protestant. So I'm not very familiar, with what other religions do, if you're Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish. But this is what I've been accustomed to or used to my whole life. So when somebody dies here in the United States, of course, you have to have the body. And it goes to a place called a mortuary. Mortuary is kind of a strange sounding word, maybe a little bit different for you to pronounce, but it's mortuary. And it's a building, where the body is, I don't say processed, where the body is prepared, or the body is made ready, I guess, to go through the next steps of the, funeral process. And I think they do something that is called embalming the body. I think they put some chemicals in the body so it doesn't decay very quickly, so the body can stay, for some time, so it can go through the process. So that's called a mortuary. And then after that, and typically when somebody dies here in the U.S., United States, within a week, you have the wake and the funeral, and then you go to the cemetery or grave site for the burial. So all that happens pretty quickly. And I think in other countries it may take a little bit longer, but here, usually within a week or sometimes sooner, 4 or 5 days, the process is completed. So the body goes to the mortuary, and then the family makes arrangements with what we call a funeral home. And that's kind of the place that handles a lot of the specific details of the process after a person dies, getting the body kind of prepared, getting the body ready for what we call the wake, make arrangements with the church and for the funeral service, And then for the burial process, and I'm going to highlight or go over all these things, but you usually deal with and work with a funeral home. And I'm going to go over all the costs for this type of stuff toward the end of the video. So stay tuned, hang on, and you'll be able to see how much it costs here. And like I said before, here in the U.S., everything seems to cost a lot of money, and even death costs a lot of money. So people have to be prepared, because a lot of times, if you don't, a lot of people can't afford to pay for their burial services here. And there's even insurance that people can get for the whole burial and death process. So if you're Catholic or Protestant, usually the first thing you do once the mortuary prepares the body, you have a wake. We call it a wake, W-A-K-E, or sometimes it's called a viewing ceremony, where you go to view, or you go to see, or you go to look at the body, or a lot of times the typical expression is a wake. And usually the wake is held for a period of, say, 4 to 6 hours, usually at a funeral home. At the funeral home, it's a location where people can go the day before the actual funeral. So the wake occurs the day before the funeral, and it's open at the funeral home for, like I said, 4 to 6 hours, where people can come and pay their respects to the dead person and their family, and also view the body. And the body is, placed in a casket. So where the body is put into, it's a kind of a wooden, I don't want to say wooden box, but it's decorative, it's ornate, we say. But the box is called a casket. And it's placed in the funeral home in a room, and people can walk up front and view the body. And the casket can be either open, where you can actually see the person, or it can be closed. So we say it can be open casket or closed casket. And usually around the casket there's a lot of flowers. So relatives and friends send flowers to the family to be placed in the room where the wake is being held near the casket. Like I said, the purpose of the wake is that people can view the body and say their goodbyes. If you're Catholic, a lot of times there will be a rosary that is said for the deceased person or the dead person, where a priest will come, or a deacon or somebody from the church, and they will lead the people there in the saying of the rosary. And the priest may come and just say a few words. He may speak about the dead person, their life, excuse me, and things like that. If you're Protestant, you won't say the rosary, but the priest, or sometimes we also call him the minister, or maybe the pastor. The minister comes and he will say a few words or speak about the deceased person as well at the funeral home during the wake. And what's become common these days is that the family can prepare a slideshow, a PowerPoint slideshow or presentation with pictures that kind of just cycle the whole time during the wake, so people can see kind of the life of the person that died. There's pictures of the person throughout their life, and even have music playing. So that's very common these days. So after the wake, the next day is the actual funeral service, and usually this occurs at a church, but sometimes it can occur at the funeral home as well. It depends. Say if the person was not a member of a church or a church body, you can have the funeral service at the funeral home, but it can also be held at the church that the person was a member at. So that morning, usually the funeral is held in the morning, like around 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and the people come, and usually the funeral service lasts about an hour, and there's a lot of religious ceremony, and the priest, if you're Catholic, the priest will say something for maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes about the deceased person. Or if you're Protestant, the pastor or the minister will talk and say things about the deceased as well. And then the funeral service is over, and everybody who has time and wants to goes to the burial service or the burial process. And this is held at the cemetery or the grave site. So another word for cemetery is grave site. So usually people get in their cars and they drive to the cemetery or the burial site where the burial or the burial service is going to be held. And this is interesting because people get in their cars, but there is what we call a funeral procession. Have you heard that word, procession? So procession is just like a line or group of cars that follow one another or follow each other. And in front of the group of cars, in front of the procession, are usually motorcycle cops or motorcycle police, riding motorcycles. And their job is to, when you come to an intersection with traffic lights or stop signs, they stop the traffic or oncoming traffic so the procession can proceed or go through without having to stop. So that's very common. They say that it's very dangerous, though, for these police officers riding these motorcycles, because a lot of times they are hit by other people in other cars or vehicles that are not part of the funeral procession. So then you drive, it could be 10, 15 minutes. Sometimes I've been in a funeral procession where you had to drive about an hour to get to the cemetery site. Everybody parks at the cemetery. You get out and you walk to what we call the burial location or the burial plot. The burial plot is just the location in the cemetery where the deceased person is going to be buried at. So it's called the burial plot. And you go to the plot, and the people at the funeral home transport or drive the casket from the church to the cemetery. And then there's a group of usually 6 men that are called pallbearers. And they take the casket from the church, put it into the vehicle that's going to transport it to the cemetery, and then they take the casket out of the vehicle and bring it to the site in the cemetery at the burial plot. So they're called pallbearers. There at the burial site, there's a brief ceremony, maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes. The priest or the pastor says a few words, and they dismiss everybody so that they can leave. And then the casket is put into the ground later or after everybody has left. Then usually after the burial service at the cemetery, there is formal word, we call it a repast. And this is just a time for people to get together and eat and have a meal, food and drink. And it's usually could be held at the church hall, we call it, the church hall, which is a special room or location at the church, or it can be held at another, say, facility in town or nearby, wherever the family can find a place where people can meet, or it can even be held at someone's house. But that's called the repast. And maybe what usually happens, when somebody dies at the wake or even after the burial service at the repast, it's a time for people to kind of get together where you can talk and see and visit with people you haven't seen before haven't seen in a long time. And that's maybe a sad thing to say, but a lot of times we don't see friends and family members until somebody dies, and that's the only time we're able to see them or make contact with them. So again, that's the repast, the food. So that's the process of when a person dies here in the United States. I'll recap. Usually within a week, if the person dies, you have the wake and the funeral and the burial and the repast, all within 4, 5, 6 days, 7 days. So the first thing, the body goes to a mortuary, is prepared. You have the wake at the funeral home for the viewing of the body. The next day, You have the funeral service is at a church or can be at the funeral home. Then right after that, you go to the burial site or the cemetery, and then you have the repast. So is that similar to what happens in your country when somebody dies? And now I want to go over the costs for having a funeral, or when somebody dies, funeral costs with burial here in Texas. So the average cost here in Texas is about $7,000 for a funeral and burial. And the cost includes basic services of $2,195. It's called transfer of the remains to the funeral home. So I guess from the mortuary, somebody's got to transfer the body to the funeral home. That's about $350. Embalming process, that's when they put the chemicals in the body to help preserve it. That's $750. Then usually the funeral home prepares the body. They make the person look presentable, and they put some clothes on the body, maybe do some makeup. That's $255. The use of the facilities and staff for viewing. So at the funeral home where people go to view the body, there's a charge for that to use a facility. That averages $425. Facilities for a ceremony, say if you want to use the funeral home instead of a church, that's $500. The cost of the casket is $2,898, so almost $3,000 just for the casket. Transportation with the body from the funeral home to the church and then to the grave site, that's $340. And the specific name of the vehicle that transports the dead body is called a hearse. A hearse. And then a lot of times the funeral home will provide vehicles for the family to ride in from the church to the cemetery and back. And that's $150. The use of the hearse is $340, if I didn't say that. A lot of times there are printed materials that people can get when they come to the funeral home, talking about the person and what's going to happen. That's $175. And then there's something called the vault. So the casket typically here is placed inside of like a concrete box or concrete container that kind of helps protect the casket and keeps the ground from collapsing or sinking. That's called the vault, and that's $1,386. So the total cost for that, like I said, is a little bit less than $7,000 at $6,933. But it's important to note that this doesn't include the following costs. It doesn't include the headstone, or sometimes called the grave marker. So this is like a concrete piece of marble, maybe not concrete, marble, we say slab or headstone that's placed on top of the ground where the person is buried, and it might have their name, their date when they're born, date they died, and something about them. That's called the headstone or the grave marker. So it marks the grave, it marks the site where the person is buried, and that can range from almost from $200 up to $10,000. And the cost that I gave you, almost $7,000, doesn't include the burial plot. So it doesn't include the location in the cemetery where the person is actually buried. And that can cost anywhere from $1,000 to $4,000. And so as you can see, a burial and funeral cost for a person here in the United States can be pretty expensive. It can cost anywhere from, let's say, $8,000 to $11,000, $12,000. So a lot of times people, may not have that kind of money. So a lot of times people will plan this when they're still alive. They'll talk to a funeral home or cemetery, and they will purchase their burial insurance before they die. So when they die, the family doesn't have to worry about that. And there's also one other cost that's involved in a burial. So when the body is placed in the ground in the cemetery, there's something called, it's called perpetual care. So the location in the cemetery needs to be maintained. Somebody has to cut the grass. Somebody has to make sure it looks good, it's neat. So there's a cost for the cemetery to maintain the burial plot or burial site, and that's usually 5 to 15% of the cost of the burial plot. So like I said, the burial plot can cost anywhere between, what was it, $1,000 to $4,000. So the perpetual care maintenance can cost anywhere from $50 to $600. So just cost. So is it like that here in your country? And I'll close with one last thing. It's becoming more and more popular these days that some people want to be cremated instead of buried in the ground in a casket. It's not as common, though, as the typical burial process, but it's becoming more popular. And the average cost of cremation here in Texas is about $4,700 or almost $5,000. And a lot of the costs are the same as far as cremation in comparison to a burial, but you don't have a casket, you have an urn. So the ashes of the person has to go to a crematorium. It's a location where the body is burned, and then the ashes are placed into a container called an urn and given to the family. So that's the death and burial process here in the United States. Hey, let me know what it's like in your country. Is it similar or is it very different? So again, hope you enjoyed this and learned something new, learned some new vocabulary and phrases and just customs and cultures here in the United States. So again, hey, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell your friends about it. And thanks for watching this episode of Learn Everyday English. And we'll be bringing you more videos like this of different topics, and hope you're just enjoying these, and have a good day, rest of the week, weekend, wherever you are in this world, and we'll see you later. Bye.